Well, on behalf of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and, of course, the Labor Solidarity Project here at the University of Washington, Tacoma, I'd like to welcome everybody back to our fall seminar series, Organizing for Change. My name's Alex Miller. I'm an associate teaching professor here at UW-T, where I teach courses in labor studies, American studies, and literature. We've got another, I know I say this every week, we got an outstanding event coming your way this evening. And I also say this a lot, but I think this one hits super close to home, maybe closer to home than any event we've done. We're going to be welcoming a group of our very own students and some graduates who are doing some incredibly important work, studying the challenges involved with attending college here at the UW, and contending with some stress that I'm sure pretty much everybody on this call is familiar with. That is, of course, the stress of managing, coursework, with the financial burdens of being a student, trying to navigate the competing demands that come with being a student worker, student/worker, trying to strike that balance between the obligations that each of those two identities create. And as a faculty member who, many moons ago was also once a working student, I'm aware of how hard it is to find that like Goldilocks zone to thread that needle. Having said that, I'll be the first to admit that attending school, attending the UW in 2024 presents some unique extracurricular challenges. Oh, I'm sorry, my phone's buzzing. Um, you're competing against challenges that I didn't have to face 20 years ago. Rising costs related to housing, transportation, and of course tuition. Stressors, financial pressure that's forced students to make hard decisions about whether or not to buy course materials or whether to pay the rent. And all of this, of course, is happening during a period in American history that's really like witnessed a federal retreat from funding education, right? And I think that, today's students, you all are, you're being forced to burden, more of a load than ever before. You're incurring more of those risks as you bet on your future. And I think that this is like, from my perspective, it's a moment that demands an intervention, a reconsideration of what people like me are expecting of our students. And it's time for like a real introspective analysis of like how we as educators, how our administrators, how our institutions can do better. And so we're really fortunate to be joined tonight by a group of students, who are performing that essential first step of this intervention, which is like fully understanding and wrapping their heads around the scale and the contours of this problem, which I think will eventually allow us to move from one thing that we do really well, or I should say we do a lot, but not very well, is make assumptions about student need and to arrive at some actual like data-driven strategies and solutions that support our students and also like honor the incredible commitment that you all are making to our institutions. So I'm really excited to welcome our guests tonight to share this exciting research project on the working lives of UW students. And so we have joining us, we've got Bisma Ali, who's a research assistant, formerly of UW Bothell, but now at UW Seattle. We've got Maya Cruz, who's a researcher and a UW Seattle grad from 2023, who's currently working at the Bridge Center. We have UW-T's own Niki Muratori, who is a research assistant from UW-T. Special shout out to UW-T. And then Sara Sprague, who is a research assistant at UW Seattle, or formerly at UW Seattle, recently congratulations, Sara, who is now down in California. So Thanks for zooming in and joining us tonight and sharing that, this expertise, the lived expertise of being a student at UW, but also the expertise that comes through, doing a research project like this. So we've got, we've had students submitted questions ahead of time, but as always, during the presentation, if you got questions, just feel free to jot them down in the chat, and then we'll kind of transition over to Q&A once the presentation is done. So before that, though, as always, join me tonight in giving our guests a warm UW-T digital welcome.
Great, thank you, Alex, for that introduction, and thanks for having us here today. We're all really excited to be here and to share with you all our research that we've been working on for the better part of the past year. Yeah, it's definitely been a labor of love, and I hope you're all excited to hear about it, especially after reading about Unseen Costs, which is sort of, I consider a sister report, but based down in UCLA from the UCLA Labor Center. Okay, so welcome to the State of the Student Worker, presented by the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies research team. So a bit about the Bridges Center, if you don't know, we were founded by ILWU pensioners and union members about 30 years ago in honor of the ILWU founder and labor leader, Harry Bridges. We partner with students, staff, and faculty to provide education, research, and more to benefit workers in Washington State and beyond. And if you want to stay in touch with us anyway, we have our website and our Instagram right here.
Alex just did a great job at introducing us, but the research team was made up of various students from every campus, and the people we have presenting here today is Maya Cruz, who majored in political science and labor studies, Sara Sprague, who majored in law societies and justice and political science, Bisma Ali, who is a current UW student majoring in medical laboratory sciences, and myself, Niki, student at UW-T, and I'm majoring in ethnic, gender, and labor studies.
So what kind of guided the start of this project was the question of what is a student worker? A student worker is someone who attends an institution of higher education, UW for an example, and they work at least one paid position. So why choose to study student workers? Well, for starters, there's not a lot of existing literature on student workers from a labor perspective. You all kind of had a little bit of an introduction to the UCLA report. The UC schools all have labor centers at every single campus. So they're getting started on recognizing student workers as folks in their community. But here in Washington, we were the first school in Washington to kind of ask these questions about what is a student worker and why should we be studying them? So one of the biggest reasons to study them is it's a resource and organizing tool that we can give back to our communities.
So, as you all may know, the University of Washington is not a single institution, but divided into 3 campuses across Washington state. Each has their own community, demographics, and programs. In Bothell, you'll find that 90% of students are pursuing their undergraduate degrees. The most popular schools there include the School of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics, or STEM, the School of Business, and the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences. In Tacoma, 70% of the campus is composed of commuters, with 82% of the students attending full-time. The most common majors are psychology, computer and information sciences, and business administration and management. As the largest campus, Seattle holds 50,000 students. 68% of the student body is undergraduate students, with 27% of those students being first-generation college students. The most popular majors at this campus are psychology, computer science, and biochemistry. All 3 of these campuses are diverse, not only in the educations they provide, but also in their respective cities' cost of living. Under King County, Bothell and Seattle's hourly cost of living at a living wage rate for one adult is $30.08. Their minimum wage for employers with less than 500 employees is $17.25, and for employers with more than 500 employees, it's $19.97. That $2.72 difference is accounted for by medical benefits or tips. Conversely, as a part of Pierce County, Tacoma's hourly cost of living at a living wage rate for one adult is $24.51, with a minimum wage of $16.28.
Excuse me. So this report is consisted of surveys and semi-structured interviews. We began our survey development in October of 2023, and then we followed that by distributing our survey between January 2024 through March. Followed by that, we did interviews between April and June. We did about 13 interviews. Our goal was 15, but due to time constraints as well as response rates, we were only able to hit about 13. But thankfully, we were able to get over 600 survey responses when we distributed in the winter. As a requirement to take the survey, you had to be a part-time undergraduate at the bare minimum, as well as have at least one paid position. And you might have taken the survey yourself. You might have seen it distributed through outreach done by our student worker team. We really emphasize doing or using research done through the lens of community-based participatory action research, which includes stakeholders at each part of the research process. So when we were developing our survey, we sought the feedback from different student groups that we knew consisted of people who were student workers. Our team, as you saw from our introductions, is widely student workers, and our interviewers were widely student workers as well. Our student worker sample ended up being pretty similar to the total undergraduate population. We had 71% of responses from Seattle, 17% of responses were from Tacoma, and 12% responses were from Bothell. So getting into our demographics, 70% of our respondents were women, including transgender women, 24% were men, including transgender men, and 6% were non-binary. We did have an overrepresentation of women, and for our race and ethnicity, the majority of our respondents were white at 52%, followed by Asian and or Asian American student workers at 38%. And then we see some low numbers for our other racial and ethnic identities that we surveyed for: 5% Black and or African American, 1% Indigenous, 11% Latina or Hispanic, 8% multiracial, 1% Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander, and 3% other. 80% of our survey respondents were Washington residents, 28% are first-generation college students, 5% have dependents, with more representation in Tacoma at 10%, and Bothell at 8%, compared to Seattle's 3%. So the first section of our findings is about where and why students work. We asked students about how many paid positions they had, and 73% of student workers work in at least one paid position, 23% work in two. 57% of all of our respondents work at UW for at least one of their positions. We found that those who work two jobs the most are those who identify as Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. And those who reported 3 or more jobs are Latina or white. And we have the rest broken down by race and ethnicity. The majority of respondents did report just working one job. But yeah, that is our breakdown for paid positions. For hours per week, we found that the majority of students work 10 to 19 hours at 54%. And that students who work at UW have a weekly limit of 19.5 hours, though 19% of students who work at UW work over 19 hours. The industries that were reported the most in our survey were in educational services, followed by food and beverage services. However, 43% of our respondents answered other, and the industries that we found the most in these other responses were administrative services, childcare, civic and social organizations, domestic work, healthcare, government, library services, recreation, and research. We also asked students if they worked in any unpaid positions, and we found that 29% of student workers work in at least one unpaid position. 54% of these unpaid positions are at a UW campus. Industries represented in unpaid positions include communications, civic and social organizations, legal services, research, and school and education. And we also found from survey responses that students were working in unpaid positions for degree requirements, or were often working over 15 hours at a UW campus unpaid position. Next, we have reasons for working and financial aid. 84% of student workers reported working to afford daily expenses. 66% reported working to gain job experience, and 46% reported working to afford housing, followed by 37% to fund all or part of tuition. And 20% of student workers work to support family and friends with their expenses. We found that 41% of respondents do not receive financial aid. And 22% of student workers in Tacoma do not receive financial aid, compared to 44% in Seattle and 47% in Bothell. However, the type of financial aid that is most received is federal grants at 32% and federal loans at 26%. And 70% of student workers receive more than one type of financial aid. Most students do not experience food insecurity or housing instability, though 22% of student workers reported that they probably experience housing insecurity or, food insecurity. Was looking at my notes. Next, we ask students about their goals and aspirations following their undergraduate experience at UW. 22% of respondents reported that they plan to attend graduate school. 47% plan to work in a paid position. Meanwhile, 54% plan to do both. We also asked students if it was important to them that their work relates to their studies or their career path, and if their work is related to their studies and or career goals. And we found that those who find it important that their work is related to their career path, they are often not working in positions that are related. And this could be for a variety of reasons, but many noted that the jobs that weren't related paid the most or were more flexible for their schedules, which is important for their positions as a student.
Our research also looked at students' experiences balancing work and school responsibilities. Most respondents agreed with the statement that balancing work and school affects their stress levels at 83%. A large discrepancy appeared based on gender identity, where 91% of students who identify as non-binary agreed with the statement, compared to students who identify as man or woman agreeing with the statement at 81% and 84%. There was also a significant correlation between the number of hours students worked and whether they agreed with the statement. So 70% of students who worked less than 10 hours a week agreed with the statement, while 83% of students who worked 10 to 19 hours a week agreed with the statement, and 94% of students who worked 20 to 29 hours a week agreed. 91% of students who work 30 to 39 hours agreed, and 81% of students who work 40 hours or greater agreed that balancing work and school affected their stress levels. This suggests that working less hours per week may benefit students' stress levels.
To gain a greater insight into the physical and mental impact of working while being a student, survey respondents were asked to what extent they would agree with the statement, "I have enough time on a daily basis to tend to my own mental and physical needs." The response was split, with 42% of respondents disagreeing with having enough time to tend to their health and 43% agreeing. According to the graph depicted on the screen, Tacoma campus respondents felt they had the least amount of time in their day to dedicate to their mental and physical needs in comparison to the Bothell and Seattle campuses. If we take into account the data surrounding student stress levels when it comes to balancing responsibilities in conjunction with the daily lack of time for personal health, we can see an overall negative impact on their academic experience. Beyond mental and physical health, research demonstrates that time for social engagement is a key component for educational success in university students. When interviewing survey respondents, a common thread arose in the sacrifice of social life to prioritize their work and school responsibilities. When we were looking at the impact of being a student worker on academic performance, we found that 32% of student workers would agree that their work negatively impacts their performance at school. And when looking at how work schedules coincided with academic activities, we found that 64% of student workers reported missing office hours due to work. 20% of students have missed lectures and class time, and 37% have been unable to attend group meetings. 29% have missed advising opportunities, and 6% have missed quizzes or exams due to their work schedules.
The next section in our findings has to do with the working conditions of student workers. We found that over 80% of student workers reported that their employers accommodate for their academic needs and student schedules, and 89% of their employers kept safe and healthy working conditions. So overall, they were mostly positive working conditions in our survey. One student told us that their role was clearly defined and they were able to take their break and take sick hours if they needed. Another student noted that their employer was incredibly flexible and supported them better than they had anywhere else. If they had any trouble with their classes, their employer was very willing to accommodate for them and their needs. So these are a few examples of what it takes for employers to be helpful to their students and make sure that they have positive working conditions rather than negative ones. When it comes to negative working conditions, we found that the most common instance of wage theft that students were experiencing was not receiving a paid break when required at 15%. And 35% of student workers who did experience that type of wage theft worked in the restaurant industry. One student noted that they didn't know they were supposed to have breaks, so they never had one, no matter how long that shift was. And this shows that employers often are not enforcing these paid breaks despite being required. Another issue we saw was in scheduling. We found that 25% of respondents reported that their employer does not provide a written schedule. In the city of Seattle, we also have the secure scheduling ordinance, which requires employers to post their schedule or post their employee's schedule at least 2 weeks in advance, which would be incredibly beneficial for students in all cities, not just Seattle. One student noted that they were not receiving their schedule until the night before, which you can imagine how stressful it is when you have an entire day of classes as well as work following your classes. We also discussed discrimination with our survey respondents, and we found that 3% of student workers reported that their employer has discriminated against them, and 9% reported that they were unsure. We found that student workers were experiencing racism, sexism, sexual harassment, and transphobia. These instances of racism often looked like employees being told that they were not allowed to speak Spanish, despite that being their native language. And we found that student workers were being misgendered in the workplace, and their employers were refusing to use their correct pronouns. Next, we have retaliation. 15% of student workers have experienced fear of retaliation in the workplace, and 36% reported feeling uncomfortable speaking to their employer to address issues at work. 5% of students reported experiencing retaliation itself, with one student saying, "I'm not a part of a labor union, and I was told that if I attempt to start one, then me and everyone else involved will be fired." The student is coming from Tacoma, and no matter where you are, this is illegal, and everyone has a right to organize. So this is just one example of what retaliation can look like, but it looks like a lot of different things.
Coinciding with rights violations is our worker rights awareness. So how aware are students of the rights they're entitled to, of Washington state labor law, the fact that they should be getting their schedule advance, or they should be getting paid overtime, or if they're opening and then closing, they get an option with that in the city of Seattle. So when rating worker rights awareness, only 5% of workers reported their knowledge of worker rights to be extremely adequate. Student workers from UW-Tacoma reported the highest rates of inadequate knowledges, and across race and ethnicities, those who identified as Native or Pacific Islander reported the lowest knowledge of worker rights. In our interviews, we got some kind of scary testimony from students who had experienced rights violations, and one quote is listed below. "I remember taking the survey and I was like, wow. I was like, all my rights are being violated." And I kind of knew that to a point just because of how I was feeling. When it comes to rights violations, 26% of survey respondents reported they were definitely not aware of any rights violations they may have experienced at a given time. 9% reported they were definitely aware. So the problem is that if you don't know your rights to start with, then when they're violated, you have a really hard time identifying and then defending yourself in those experiences. I didn't really know there were any laws that we're supposed to be following, one Tacoma interviewee said. And I also don't really know anything about labor laws, but I figured like they're probably following every law. I don't know. I never really thought about it, a Seattle interviewee said. One way to educate yourself on your workers' rights and defend yourself in faces of rights violations are through union membership. And 9% of student workers who took our survey reported being members of a union. Bothell and Tacoma reported the highest rates of union membership, with 13% compared to Seattle's 7%. 15% of student workers 15% of student workers have discussed organizing a union with their coworkers, but as that quote that Maya gave earlier, that's not always successful or safe in a lot of working places. So we really want to make sure that you all understand that everyone is entitled to organize. And then the unions that were represented in the survey are listed below for those that are interested.
So with these findings in mind, we have a couple of recommendations that are entirely informed by the responses given to us by our student workers who took this survey. And the first is we are calling for Washington State to mandate workers' rights education in public high schools. This would be following in the footsteps of California, which just passed a similar law in 2023 and is effective this year. They are establishing a workplace readiness week for 11th and 12th graders. This would be a week dedicated to worker education, covering topics such as child labor laws, worker safety, the right to organize, as well as the role of the labor movement in securing these rights and protections for workers. Washington State would benefit from this in many ways. And as we saw before, that student workers aren't really aware of their workers' rights, and it's not their fault. We are not taught this in any way, shape, or form in our public education, in high school, and it can be a little tricky learning about it too if you're an undergraduate. You know, it's not really in the best interest of employers for their student workers to know that they have these rights. But if we incorporate this law into Washington, that could definitely change, and we could see more opportunities for students to protect themselves from any potential rights violations in the future.
We also recommend that the secure scheduling ordinances that were adopted in Seattle be spread nationwide. Secure scheduling or statewide. Secure scheduling in Seattle has been shown to improve scheduling predictability and stability, increase job and schedule satisfaction, enhance overall happiness and sleep quality, and reduce workers' material hardships. This is based off of a 2-year assessment that was done after Seattle adopted secure scheduling. We recommend that these benefits be extended to all students and workers across Washington State.
We are also calling for the University of Washington to adopt workers' rights trainings for managers. Currently, managers or employers are not required to take any trainings about workers' rights or labor laws. Their only training is about implicit bias. And so this creates a gap of knowledge for both managers and their student employees, who, as we heard before, probably do not know their rights either. So this just creates more opportunity for employers to either intentionally or unintentionally exploit their students and potentially commit any rights violations. So if we incorporate a training that would better equip our employers and our students with the tools that they need, we'll eliminate this gap of any potential violations.
We also believe that it would be highly beneficial to put efforts towards improving the accessibility of workers' rights education. 45% of respondents from the survey rated their workers' rights knowledge as inadequate. 46% of respondents reported being unaware of their rights being violated, whether it be in the form of wage theft, not getting their paid or unpaid breaks, and working back-to-back closing and opening shifts. We recommend that we recommend to implement a workers' rights education course during new student orientation and in early job training at the UW. This way, all UW students will be better equipped for their future as workers. This is somewhat in effect through the Title IX course that is required by new UW students and when UW students become employees within the system as a functional model to get important information across, and we think it could definitely be adjusted for workers' rights education.
We also think that academic accessibility can be vastly improved for University of Washington students. Taking you back to the beginning of our presentation, Maya listed out all of the different things that student workers reported having to miss because of work. This included office hours, classes, even sometimes exams. That it happens where sometimes you get scheduled over a class time and there becomes a conflict, and how do you resolve that? So academic accessibility would mean classes, lectures, office hours are fully accessible to students, able to reschedule to their work schedules, able to be done virtually, and able to meet their needs so they are able to balance working, paying for their life, and going to school. We also would like to implement advanced union awareness at the University of Washington. This can be done either at the beginning of the year, same with first year orientation that Bisma talked about, with giving platforms to local unions in the area, including our own UW union, or could be done through workshops where different unions come in to talk to different majors, such as nurses who are a heavily unionized field, to talk about unionization in that industry. What this would do is show students there are platforms to defend their rights through and platforms to negotiate accessible and just working conditions.
So to conclude this presentation and our research, we want to cover the base that the experiences of student workers are varied depending on their gender identity, race and ethnicity, the number of jobs they have, how many hours they work, and more. We kind of saw through everything that we covered that student workers aren't experiencing the same issues, but they are all united in the fact that they are students and workers, and the protections that they have are not really advanced for that, or I'm blanking on the word, are not really at the top of everyone's minds. You hear a student worker, and I feel like primarily you think about the fact that they're college students and they don't really need these protections, but at the end of the day, all workers are worthy of these protections and of being in a union. So with that in mind, we hope that this report will serve as a resource for student workers and their employers to better understand and address their needs.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's have another round of applause for our team of panelists here and the people who the et al in the list, all the people who contributed to this work. This was absolutely fantastic. I think when I was promoting this over the course of last week, I think the poster said the state of the UW student worker. And from my perspective as a faculty member down in Tacoma, it's almost redundant to say student worker because so many of my students are workers. I mean, it's just UW students. I mean, when you look at, we're talking about 73% of students. I mean, it's an overwhelming majority. And so, creating institutions that accommodate or are cognizant of the fact that you all have multiple competing demands on your time is just like, the time to make that pivot is, it's long overdue. And I feel like this report, it's kind of back channeling in the chat. Like, I just wish all of my colleagues were here to see this. I'm so glad that there's going to be a report that they can actually look at. Maybe this is recorded and shared, because it's just, people need to know this. Yeah, I'm really impressed. I want to hand it over to the Q&A. So if people have questions, I know there were some. We already have a question about sort of resources you can share, and I see hands are flying up. But again, like I want to echo what was said in the chat about the recommendations. I don't think, some of these are big asks, and some of them seem very reasonable. Like they would not be that hard to institute at a tri-campus level, like as soon as the beginning of next year. So yeah, that's initial thoughts, and I will. I'm gonna pass the mic over to Tyler, who's got a hand up.
Okay, hello. That was a really good presentation. I thought that was really great. And I read a little bit on the reading and I thought that was really cool as well. I guess can you talk a little bit more like about internships? Because I'm actually a student worker right now, and I'm gonna also put that on my resume because I'm into the media and video production team. And so I thought that would be kind of cool just to get into the entertainment business. But like what are your thoughts on like after when you graduate and getting a job and like internships while you're in school? Yeah.
It's an excellent question. I think it points to the often uncompensated reality of a lot of student work too. So I was kind of curious about that during your presentation. How many students you interviewed were participating in unpaid internships that were sort of like run through majors, graduation expectations, that placed them in situations where they weren't being adequately compensated.
Yeah, one of our students was in a position where they were being overworked. They were paid through a grant, but they were putting in more hours than they were getting paid for. And they said in the response that they were happy to work more hours than they were paid for. But of course, this shouldn't be the case. We should be getting compensated for every hour of work that is being put into whatever it is that you're working on. And just because, student workers are students does not mean it doesn't make their value or their labor unvaluable. It's more valuable if you think about it because, they have all these other responsibilities that they're balancing, and the job they might have is just adding on top of it. And then an unpaid position is just adding on top of it. So definitely these internships that everyone takes on or whoever takes on definitely should be compensated.
Yeah, I'll add on, to take our survey, you had to be employed by one paid position, but of those students who were employed by at least one paid position, 30% said that they were also employed in at least one unpaid position within the past year. And over half of those 30% were through the University of Washington. So think like your professor-led research programs. So it's super common and definitely something that needs to be dug into deeper because that's a really big stressor on a lot of students.
Yeah, no, it's increasingly becoming sort of part of, certification processes, at times managing sort of a full-time job that you're using to pay the tuition, but also having to take on sort of a second shift where you're performing, when I was an undergrad, I did a student teaching experience, which was basically, 3 months of full-time teaching. Not only was I not being paid, but I was, paying for the opportunity to do that. And I feel like that often happens at, research opportunities sort of like are compensated through exposure, and it's, I think now is also an appropriate time to put in a plug for the Bridges Center Building a Movement program, which is a compensated internship program. So consider checking that one out. I see, Chloe, you've got a hand up.
So mine's more of a curiosity based question, maybe suggestion. I don't know what to call it. So before anything happens that needs to be addressed by a union, the average student worker is going to have to deal with HR usually. You're I'm at a loss at so I worked at Whole Foods and I injured my back working there, and I had a horrible experience with the HR lady, and that's how I learned you are nice to HR no matter what. You never know. And that's like my general rule, but she was particularly cranky. I don't know what her deal was. I really loved working at Whole Foods. Most people there were really nice, but the HR lady from the get-go was standoffish, and I didn't know how to talk to her or represent myself or advocate for myself or know what I was supposed to be doing. And so when we're talking about like how to stand up for your rights and not be abused at work, I would suggest / ask that in the programs that you guys are trying to implement in high schools and at the union, that something be added to know some kind of literacy about how to interact with the people that you're going to be talking to about those rights, because there's going to be some representative, be it HR, be it some kind of arbitrator for the company that you're working for, whoever, legalese that you don't understand. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point. I think that's, part of the sort of definition of that position is to, I mean, at least in my experience and my familiarity with HR is to sort of initially push back and, as we heard from the presentation, folks are frequently misled about what their rights are. And I think that, yeah, you're right. Like it's, without the representation of a union, yeah, you are sort of left on your own, and you get more flies with honey than you do with vinegar, right? So it's like, it definitely helps to, be nice, but at the same time, like when you're, if you've injured yourself and you need the, the support from the workplace, like it's, it's difficult. And I think that that's, yeah, that's, I mean, this is a reason why it's, not only does labor education need to be taught once as people are graduating and potentially entering the field, but it's, this is something that like, needs to be sort of a refrain over the course of secondary education, in my opinion.
Yeah. So maybe just like a curiosity question / suggestion when you're advocating for the programs in the high schools, the literacy through workers' rights, maybe also on the advocacy for yourself part, maybe the literacy or understanding of how to interact with those entities for your rights.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Does anybody on the panel have any additional thoughts on that front?
Yeah, I mean, advocating for yourself is scary no matter what. We saw that, fear of retaliation is a thing and retaliation is a thing. But that's why we called for workers' rights education to happen sooner rather than later at the high school level, and then also at the undergraduate level, where some folks might not be from Washington and coming into the UW and here's an avenue where they can access this information. And I'm also thinking about how worker power comes from the collective and not individually. So if you have coworkers who, you might trust or would feel similar to you, I think confiding in them and sort of working through these issues together is definitely an avenue you can potentially advocate for yourself and each other. That way no one has to go through this alone.
Nice, excellent point. Thanks for the question, Chloe. I see, Kiana, you have a hand up.
Yes, thank you. I loved this presentation. I wanted to say a lot of the things in the article, like the double shift of working and learning, I could completely relate to that as I work full-time and go to college full-time, which can be hard. One of the biggest things that helped me personally and possibly other students was the pandemic. It made it possible to have like the capability of a flexible schedule, being able to work full-time and take online courses, more night classes were offered, and even on-campus classes too. But as the pandemic kind of improved, sometimes it feels like schools and society is trying to revert to how it was before. I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
Yeah, so that was a big part of increasing classroom accessibility. I know at least I went to college in the pandemic too, and being able to watch recorded lectures was a huge asset when I had work that day, for an example. And as professors are kind of shifting away from that and making it almost uncomfortable to ask to have pre-recorded lectures, it makes it really difficult. And that's why it needs to be somehow implemented from a top down, that this is something students are entitled to. You're entitled to the classes you're paying for, instead of allowing professors to have a little bit of a power trip about it. And something that I always think about is we have incredible disability resources for students, but even those can get professors who don't want to fully accommodate with them. But just having a system set up to where students can advocate for accessibility in their classes is something that UW is actively working on, I would say, or at least students within it are organizing on. And we can take a lot of advice from our disabled students on campus and how they've learned to accommodate and work classes to fit their needs. And I also think of like student athletes who are able to just simply miss classes and get them accommodated. And why don't we treat our student workers that way too? So there's a lot of conversation to have there. And I totally empathize with the fact that COVID gave us a taste of how classes should be served to students.
Exactly. I love that. Thank you.
I totally agree. It's always, it feels weird to talk about COVID and post-COVID as like an opportunity. I mean, if it were it not for COVID, this seminar series would have never pivoted to Zoom, and we would have never had folks from like the East Coast coming in to present their work. So there are like, within the field, within the biz that I'm in, like I feel like, there were important advances that everyone was sort of forced to make. And it seemed like coming out of COVID during this like long off ramp, sometimes it feels like we had like the menu was wide open, like we could do sort of anything. I mean, like we can get creative. We just like made it through a pandemic, and but it was like the muscle memory kicked in, and we, like and I mean, this came from, it comes from colleagues, it comes from admin. It's like the institutional reaction of just having people physically back on campus. And I think there's like, some market-based motives behind like having you all physically come to campus. But it's like, yeah, like of all the options we chose, let's just do it like we used to do it, because everything was great in 2019. I remember having like serious conversations about what was going wrong on all campuses in 2019, but it's like coming out of COVID, it's like, let's go, this like weird nostalgia for a moment that was pre-pandemic that didn't really exist. But yeah, let's hear from Carrie.
Okay, I'm going to preface this with a quick apology. I have a couple of dogs in the background with some zoomies right now. So if it gets a little bit loud, I apologize. My question is kind of a multi-part question here. I too am a person who's working 30 plus hours a week, going to school full time. Kind of felt the irony when I was jumping onto the Zoom call because I was about 10, 15 minutes late because work, you can always be late to class, be late to these things because we can't have flexibility in our work schedule. But, unfortunately, it's often school that has to give. So kind of to get into my questions here, starting with this, do we feel like there's really going to be a big movement if we start this at the student level? I know you're really advocating for workers' rights education. But do you feel like there's going to be enough leverages just from the student side of things?
Like, as in students demanding it, or just the appetite from students to realize that this is something that they might need?
Kind of just, I guess what you're saying, like with the appetite of this is something that the students need. Like a movement always has to start from somewhere. And I truly believe that it's the students that are, have the biggest struggle, and they're the ones who are going to have to start this movement. But do we think we're gonna have more flexibility on the school side of things? Do we think we're gonna have maybe more headway if we go on the worker side of things? I feel like if we have too many variables we're trying to change, maybe we're not gonna make as much of a difference. And so I guess my big question here is, like, if we educate the students, where do you think that their effort should really be kind of focused to?
That's a great question. I'm gonna throw it to the panelists. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Any of my current students want to chime in with where they think it should start?
Yeah, I mean, I think it should go I think we should go both ways. I think students are experiencing the difficulties of balancing work and school. And so if you give them a pathway on campus where they can advocate for themselves to have more accessibility to what Sarah was saying earlier with like class work being more accessible and more accommodations for them as workers, less unpaid positions, I think they would hop on that. But I also believe that, some of the like statewide initiatives that could be done, such as the secure scheduling and implementing workers' rights trainings in high schools, I think those aren't going to be the same people. So the students advocating for stuff on campus might not be the same people advocating for stuff at the state level. So I think it would be beneficial to go at it from both ends and try to get as much done as possible.
Yeah, I think too. I mean, ironically, it's the students who might need this the most are probably also the students who have the least time to devote to, attending a program. It could be sort of something that is, I mean, there's in the same way that when you get hired by Whole Foods, when you become a student at UW, there are all sorts of like trainings that occur, including like, here's how to use the library, here's how to go get your student ID. So sort of working with whatever stakeholders on campus are in charge of kind of like assembling that itinerary and finding a space for, like, here's here's a student employee that's going to talk to you about potentially working on campus and what your rights are, and here are some resources that you might be able to deploy, once employed. It's yeah, that, I mean, it might be an opportunity. I do think too that, like, one of the interesting things about organizing student workers, like, student workers' times on campus are sort of by definition kind of finite, which is one of the reasons why it's historically been difficult to organize undergraduate student workers, right? Because they're just not around that long. It's, there's historically there's been much more success organizing grad students because they tend to be around forever, myself included. Um, but what's cool about organizing on campus is campuses also operate as like these like hubs of incubation where people come to campus, they learn, and then ideally they're sort of like dispersed into the community to become organizers, or at the very least like educated colleagues in workplaces moving forward. So it's kind of, I obviously am about as biased as can be on this issue, but I love the idea of campuses becoming this space where so not just the labor studies minor students, but all students have kind of like a compulsory opportunity or obligation to learn something about themselves as workers, because that's what I used to always say that's what you're going to be when you graduate, but I guess 73% of students already are workers. So it's like, we need to know this stuff yesterday, right? Excellent. I see, Cayman, you got a hand up.
Hi. I was just wondering uh if there's any way that colleges can streamline financial aid processes to make them more accessible and less burdensome for students, or if they would really have any sort of high inclination to even do that in the first place.
Honestly, that's probably a question best answered by somebody on the panel, because I feel like I haven't interfaced with financial aid in a while. Maybe that's something that I should probably be much more aware of as a faculty member, but I know, it was an incredibly complicated process, 15, 20 years ago. I can't imagine anything's gotten easier at this point.
Speaking to like the complexity of it, I think something that could be really useful and something that I feel like I don't really see around is like financial aid literacy workshops or like information sessions that break down all that complicated jargon of applications and help students navigate it with more ease. Which I feel like is something that could easily be done at a school level. It's not really, I think, like presumptively, I think it's not very cost heavy, and it's more just about time and effort to help a student get what they need out of financial aid. Um, and then also I think financial aid counseling for like one-on-one help for people with unique financial circumstances could be really useful. Probably not as easily done because obviously that involves hiring people, but I think it would make a lot of strides towards breaking down that barrier between students and financial aid.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Our school actually does a financial literacy at the beginning of the quarter, 2 days a week, and they actually have a drawing where you submit a short essay, and then they do a drawing for a few $100s for a grant.
Yeah, I think that's
Uh,
a great way to implement not only teaching people more about how to understand their financial aid applications, but also encouraging them to apply, because I've known some people that just never applied for financial aid because they couldn't understand the application, or they thought because of one thing or another that they wouldn't get any money out of it, so it was like a waste of time for them. So I think that's definitely a useful avenue.
and also another interruption, sorry again. Our school also has an emergency aid grant, if you didn't know. It's not very big. It's up to $500. So if like your car breaks down, or like, I don't know, your house gets broken into, or there's a fire or something and you need a place to stay for a minute, I don't know. There's a committee that approves it and it's pretty fast. So that's through financial aid as well.
Nice. I believe there was some emergency funding too during COVID that's continued. Yeah, so there are, I feel like support is there's more than there used to be, but it's still, you know,
Limited.
and in terms of the human resources, like it's, I love the staff in SIS. I just wish there were twice as many because I know, like, I mean, it's, you know, faculty's overworked. It's, it's this sort of neoliberal university trying to do more with less and trying to make everybody do two jobs at once. So it is challenging. And I think, if we had, I saw in the comment, and there have been some great comments, and I'm sorry if we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but, just sort of talking about the resources that like, student athletes have. And if you could imagine, imagine a magic Christmas land where actual students receive the same amount of support. Like how much easier it would be to navigate their university experience. I see Diana, you've got a hand up.
I love how that kind of segues into my question, and I guess I'm also building on Kiana's question as well. So accessibility has really been focused, like I guess focused on students with disabilities, like access to recorded classes and subtitled videos and stuff. And I think as a working student, for me, like I was a behavior therapist and a substitute teacher working 35 plus hours while still maintaining like a 12 credit plus quarter. It's been really difficult for me to access or like to take the classes that I've wanted to focus on. And I've really been limited to choosing classes that are asynchronous online or just fit into my required course list type deal. Luckily, UWT has a lot of courses that kind of fit that undergrad wise, but again, like emphasizing that choices are limited. Do you think that normalizing recorded in-person classes can kind of bridge this gap for working and neurodivergent students, or at least have a realistic impact for a community, for the college community on like undergrad courses or course loads?
I think that's definitely a really big help, and for not only people under like DRS, but also workers, and not just because of their schedules. I think one thing that I feel like isn't really addressed is commuting, which I know that UW-Tacoma and UW both are really big commuter schools. And for somebody that's a student worker that has really packed schedules, just getting to campus might be really hard. And if their class is recorded online, that's less time that they have to worry about getting to class and making sure they're on time and balancing everything. And that's maybe time that they can use to rest or relax instead of stressing themselves out trying to be in 10 places at once.
That's a huge issue here in Tacoma. With virtually no student residents, we have a dorm. I think there are maybe 500 students there, but it's a suitcase school, and it's gotten increasingly difficult to access. It's like we used to have 4 parking lots, and then they built a new building in one of the parking lots. So it's just like, the building attracts more students, but now there are fewer parking spaces. It's just like the perennial problem of like how much time is lost. I mean, how many days do my students not come in just because of like the obstacle that getting to and from class poses? That's a great point. I see, Joan, you've got a hand up.
Hi, yeah. I'm Joan Weiss. I'm not one of the students of Alex's class, but I've been attending these, well, since pandemic when you began Zooming. Just briefly, a bit on me. I worked at the UW in the 80s. I organized SEIU, well, now Local 925, in the 90s. And when the Bridges Center started, I actually did a few class presentations, like a little Labor 101, to a few of Jim Gregory's classes. When I stopped organizing UWers, I took a break and then did a little this and a little that. But one of the things I did at the Worker Center, which was affiliated with the Martin Luther King County Labor Council, I wrapped up the tail end of some federal money for school to work. And this was for the Summer Youth Employment Program, and then King County Youth Employment Program. And some of the things I did were some basic workshops with young people, high school students, kind of labor 101, know your rights. So of course, getting into the schools and educating folks about labor is total high priority. I'm from Detroit, grew up down the street from the Ruthers, played with his daughters, and I knew about labor because UAW, and it's Detroit. And it's unfortunate that so many folks don't know. And, you know, I wasn't really surprised in your survey responses how many of the folks you talked to or filled out surveys that indicated they really don't know their rights as workers, whether you're a student worker or any worker. So, you know, the idea to have someone in the schools educating young people about their rights is, of course, high priority. You know, whether that can be done given these days, I'm skeptical. But one of the other things I did too was some class presentations at Kent Meridian High School. And when I was organizing UWers, we always had a piece of the UW New Employee Orientation. And it occurred to me, it sounds like there is some sort of orientation for student workers. And I think you should pick labor relations behinds because they deserve it. And I don't think they've changed since the 90s. And demand that someone is able to do a little piece on for new student workers at the U to do a little piece on your rights as student workers, the way we always went into that orientation and have 15 minutes on the agenda to talk about you are represented by our union. We hope you'll join, blah, 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 and give them a little info about the union. And so, you know, I could tell you many stories and have many suggestions, but, you know, I'm not going to take up all the time tonight. Plus, you're students and workers, and you probably want to get a little sleep too. But those are just a couple thoughts I had. And, you know, I'm usually not given my 2 cents worth on these Zooms, but tonight I couldn't help myself.
No, absolutely no need to apologize, John. And thank you for continuing to support the work here. And these are great ideas. I mentioned in the chat board, I know that some of the folks involved with Tacoma Labor School, who are also members of the Tacoma Educators Association, were talking about kind of strategize. They were calling it salting the curriculum, but just sort of, you know, finding those moments where they could integrate labor education into the classroom. But this, I mean, I just took a note. Like, I do not know what, I mean, I guess I could talk to Niki about it. Like what HR onboarding looks like at UWT. Like, I know that there's some kind of training. There's some formal introduction to the system. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how accurate it is. I don't know how, like, you know, I mean, maybe Niki can speak to it, like whether it even really exists in a formal way at this point. But yeah, it seems like an opportunity to at least have a seat at that table.
Yeah, when you're coming in to UW, I think on all 3 campuses, you do have to do like a Title IX training thing, and it's all online now. So you just go through like a slideshow, you watch videos, you take little quizzes, and it trains you on like mostly around like sexual harassment and issues like that. And in our recommendations, we do recommend like either adding a workers' rights portion to that, or creating a separate training regarding working while in school that would educate people on their rights. I mean, I think, you know, it is an important issue. And the fact that students, especially students who work for UW, aren't being educated on their rights is a disservice to them.
I hear, is that your dog in the background, Niki?
Yeah, that's my dog. Sorry.
Nice. Not the dog we were promised, but the dog we got. I know Ben Brown is here and had a hand up and was going to talk a little bit about some of the work that ASUWT has been doing around this issue. I don't know, Ben.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yep. Sorry. Yeah, I just put my hand down because like it really, I guess, isn't technically a question. But Ben Brown, I'm one of Alex's student assistants, but I'm also ASUWT's Director of Legislative Affairs. And so we are currently primarily focused on like a lot of student basic needs with this coming legislative session. But one of the statewide priorities for the Washington Students Association that we are also supporting is allowing student workers to unionize, which was there was a bill that went through the legislature last session. It didn't make it all the way through, but this is something that we're going to be working on again this year. One of the things that we're kind of running into some hurdles with is like at UWT, a lot of student jobs, especially when it comes to student involvement positions, are student funded by student fees, which does kind of create sort of that difficulty when it comes to bargaining, especially because it's like, do you bargain with other students that sit on our services and activities fee board or committee, or do you negotiate it like with the school? It makes it very difficult to navigate that. But either way, definitely would love to get some of this some of the data that you guys worked on for our own legislative priorities as well, because this is, I mean, all of this is like really important stuff, especially for advocating for students. And I'm also a labor studies and poli-sci major, so like this is I mean, labor policy is kind of how I came into this position as well. So definitely would I know at UW Tacoma at least, and possibly ASUW in Seattle as well, might be interested in some of this information that we can advocate for some of the policy proposals that you all brought during your presentation.
Excellent. That's the next step, right? We've got the data. Now let's do something with it. Rachel, I thought I was DMing you, but I apparently was sharing that with everybody. I thought you had a great quote about just different classifications of student workers, and I thought that this might also be an opportunity to give a shout out to students up at Western Washington University who recently organized.
Yeah, I'll just say something. I might turn it over to Maya, who I know went to a lunch with Western Academic Workers United, or WAWU, up at Western. So that's a very exciting win of students, undergraduates, and graduate students uniting at Western Washington University and forming the Western Academic Workers United. And they've been successful in the legislature and have really made some big strides and hope to open a labor center as well. But what I said in the chat is, I think that the way that we kind of label student workers in the state of Washington, or how we have with academic student workers being able to unionize, which I'm grateful for because folks on my team have been able to be in a union, and that's amazing. But it's wrong that folks that are deemed operational workers don't have to be recognized by their employer. So they obviously have the right to talk to each other and maybe form a union, but that might not be recognized, which we saw workers up at Western go through. But I'm going to turn it over to Maya Cruz, because I believe that she also spoke with WAWU just a couple of weeks ago and had a really good conversation. So I might be missing some of the most important stuff.
Yeah, someone mentioned earlier as well about getting students involved and actually encouraged to organize. And I think WAWU is a great example of that happening right now. Alex mentioned that due to turnover, it's much more difficult to organize undergraduate students who are typically here for around 4 years, but often less. I was only a student at the University of Washington for 2 years. So I imagine if I weren't into labor, it might have been hard to organize me, but thankfully I am very interested. Yeah, but the folks at WAWU are doing a great job, and I think Western is a perfect example for the power of student workers and what they can accomplish. I'm not sure exactly, and I can't name it to a T, but they've done some great organizing around, I believe, tuition waivers. So educational student employees get a match for the work they're doing and their tuition. So they get some of their tuition waived when they're organized with UAW. So yeah, I think it's a great example of the power of student workers up there. And they want to make a labor center there as well. So it's not like the interest doesn't exist. I think there are lots of obstacles that could deter students or discourage students, but the energy is definitely there, and especially in Washington State.
Yeah, they presented at the Bridges Center Awards ceremony a couple weeks ago, and I mean they absolutely crushed it. And just talking about their contract and sort of that tuition credit that they negotiated, where it's like I think for each hour they work, the university's like matching $1 or $2 toward tuition. So it's like they're, in addition to being compensated for their labor at a much more competitive rate, they're now sort of like, I mean, it seems like their benefits are better than mine as a non-unionized faculty member. And just sneak peek of things coming up in the winter or the spring, I think we might actually have them come all the way down to Tacoma. I know they're down to travel. At the very least, they're going to zoom in, but maybe we'll get them down here to actually like meet with our student workers and maybe, agitate and organize and activate. They were just, I mean, just amazing to hear. And again, thinking about like, you know, it's a managerial tactic to have sort of a rotating cast of employees, right? This is how like fulfillment centers work. Like these jobs aren't designed to make a career out of. And I think in the same way, like when you're dealing with, workers who are only going to be around for a couple of years. At UW-T, it's, I feel like I was talking to Niki about this recently. It's like they started last year, they're going to graduate this year. Like it's just, sometimes we only get students for 2 years, and it's hard to, have them develop a sense of themselves as student workers who have solidarity with other student workers, and to dedicate the time and the effort to building a union and fighting for a contract that like you may never actually even benefit from, right? I mean, you may graduate before that thing goes through. So it's just kind of like, I don't know. I found their presentation at that event like super inspiring and kind of just like, what it's all about. So I think we've got time for maybe another question or two. I know there was one posed in the chat. Somebody said they couldn't actually ask the question. Like as always, the chat has been popping off here. But while I scroll up, did anybody else have any questions or just observations they wanted to? Oh, I see Kari or Carrie.
So I do have one other question. Sorry, hold on one second here. Okay, so this doesn't have to do with, your talk or the article that you put out for us to read, but there have been some like recent news articles in regards to Washington State University increasing their tuition rates because of a decrease in student enrollment. Do you think that this is going to become a vicious cycle that, maybe you could see impacting, students and student workers in the future?
I mean, I think potentially. I know at UW, I've seen the tuition rates increase every year as well. Same with cost of living is also increasing every year. And unless we can get those wages up, the minimum wage, as well as the potential to get raises when you are in a union, when we have those avenues to be able to pay for tuition, I would hope that they don't discourage students from attending or receiving a higher education. But the bigger argument to this is everyone deserves to go to college for free. That would be like the dream and end all be all.
Yeah,
I
it's that.
completely agree. Hopefully one day we'll get to that point.
God, yeah, it's the stripping of like the decommodification of higher education, like the, you know, looking at it as the public good that it is, right? Like I think that's um and I mean I knew a lot of these numbers, but I think reading through that UCLA study and just that tight presentation of like, the neoliberal turn and what it did to education in terms of both like just sending the price point of getting a degree through the roof, while also diminishing the earning potential of jobs that require, like, so there's that, but then also the like I mentioned in the intro, just like the federal retreat from investing in citizens who are educating themselves, who will become sort of, valuable participants in a national economy. And instead, like, it's you're on your own, kid. It's like take out some loans, roll the dice, like, that's the one thing you can guarantee you're going to get, by going to college is student debt, right? It's like, whether or not you're going to get sort of the golden ticket into the upper middle class or the middle class, like that remains to be seen. But if you take out these loans, you will have to pay them back regardless, right? And it's just, the the goalposts keep on moving for students. So I think it's reasonable to anticipate the prices are going to continue to increase at this point. But I think, mobilizing students and pushing back as the consumers of this educational product is one way to at least assert some leverage there. I did, and it's a great question, and I think it's cause for concern too. I scrolled all the way back up. I found the question. We kind of talked about it a little bit. What steps can unions take to include and support student workers who are balancing education and employment? We talked a little bit about, the kind of support that could come from a student, undergraduate student union, graduate student unions, a unionized student workforce. Any thoughts on just kind of like what the labor community more broadly can do to support, their students who are working? I don't know, does 4121 or 925, are there sort of educational incentive programs, scholarship programs?
I don't know if they have them, if someone was about to answer that.
This is Joan. Well, I can't speak to 925 these days. I'm a member and trustee of OPIU Local 8, and our international, and I'm sure SEIU International does have scholarship programs, but OP does have a scholarship program that members can apply for themselves or their kids. And so I say for you dubbers, that's something to look into. There used to be, and I'm sure they still exist, the coalition of UW labor unions. And if that exists, if it was me, I think it'd be great to plug into the coalition, maybe attend a meeting, do a presentation, and get some information from them about, hey, how can you guys help us, UWers who are students? And, how can you support us? Does your union have scholarships? Can anyone come and do some presentations to some of us student workers? Blah, blah, blah.
You go.
I agree with everything she said. I think also unions, you need to unionize more workplaces outside of school, because then a lot of the jobs that students work are just historically ununionized, right? Or are slowly becoming unionized now and struggling. So I think having more unions out in, restaurants, service industry jobs and stuff like that would greatly benefit the student body.
Nice. Well, I mean, I can't thank you all enough for coming in and sharing this work. This is again, like, selfishly, this is certainly going to affect the way I approach the classroom. I think, it's an important first step to actually making changes that, like I said, have needed to occur for a long time. So I'm just really excited to have been able to watch this come together and then, provide this little venue to get the initial. This is just like a sneak peek at what's to come. The actual report, we're still shooting for like a January release, right? Excellent. So if you're on the Labor Solidarity Project mailing list, I will of course disseminate it, and I'm sure the Bridges Center will be doing their best to get it out everywhere. Yeah, so thanks again. So one last round of applause for our guests tonight. This was great. Really enjoyed it. I say this whenever I have like younger folks on, like I love the opportunity to get like people who are just recently students and are now sort of like student practitioner experts on. And I think it's really inspiring to the students on the call to see themselves maybe like in a couple of years. So I'm super proud of you all. And again, just really thankful for this work. I really appreciate it. Excellent. Well, so come back not next Thursday.